Today we're going to consider some thoughts from Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is a psalm of David in which he writes about forgiveness and his need for forgiveness from God. If you remember back in 2 Samuel, chapter 11 records David's sin with Bathsheba. And if you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to go back and read 2 Samuel chapter 11. Because it describes his sin with Bathsheba, in which he committed adultery with her and all of the things that he went through to try to cover that up. Then in 2 Samuel chapter 12, the prophet Nathan confronted David over his sin. And prior to that point, David was overlooking his sin. He was not willing to acknowledge his sin. But after Nathan confronted him, he realized that he was guilty. He had committed this great sin, and Psalm 51 is a psalm that he writes in which he talks about this, and talks about this sin that he committed and his need for forgiveness. We won't read all of the psalm here as we look at some things from it, but I just want to notice just a few verses to highlight this and see what we can learn from it. Psalm 51, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. According to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only, I have sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak, and blameless when you judge." Those are just the first 4 verses of this psalm, and the rest of the psalm continues this theme. But notice what we can learn here just from the first 4 verses of this psalm, is that David had to appeal to God. God needed to be gracious to him because David was guilty of sin. And all of us have been in this position. Maybe we haven't committed as great of a sin as David committed, or maybe we have. Regardless of what the sin is, no matter how we might classify it, when we sin against God, we need Him to be gracious to us. We need Him to wash away those sins and not count them against us anymore. So David recognized that he needed God to forgive him. The same is true for us. We need God to forgive us of our sins. He said in verse 3 that I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. He had to recognize, and that's why I mentioned that in his sin in 2 Samuel chapter 11, it wasn't until chapter 12 where Nathan comes and confronts him that David finally realized what he had done wrong. He had to acknowledge his sin. He had to recognize it. If we're going to be able to handle our sin or deal with our sin, we have to recognize that we have sinned, that we have violated the law of God. And so this has to be before us. We have to recognize it. If we turn a blind eye to our sin, then we're not going to deal with it. We're just going to continue in that sin. We have to recognize and acknowledge our sin. But then he says in verse 4, "Against you, you only I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak and blameless when you judge." We need to recognize that when we sin against God. Yes, there are certain sins that we commit that are against others, but whether we sin against others or not, every sin is against God. We sin against Him, we need His forgiveness. And so David said there that you are justified when you speak and blameless when you judge, that we cannot fault God for holding us accountable. It's not God's fault that we violated His law. We did that. We violated His law. We sinned. And so when we sin, and all of us have sinned, all of us at some point will sin. When we sin, we need to acknowledge that. We need to recognize that we need God's forgiveness. We need Him to be gracious to us because God is perfectly fair and perfectly just when He judges. And so we need to take a lesson from this, and I encourage you to read through the rest of Psalm 51. And if you're not familiar with the story of David, 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. Read through those chapters and see David's sin, how he learned his sin, learned about his sin and his guilt before God, and how he appealed to God for forgiveness. We need to do the same thing. When we sin, we need to seek God's forgiveness, and in order to be cleaned and washed and purified by Him. All of us are going to fall. All of us are going to do things that are contrary to the will of God. We don't need to ignore that. We don't need to sweep that under the rug. But we need to come to God upon His conditions and His terms and seek after His forgiveness. He is willing to forgive. He is a gracious and compassionate God. But we have to seek His forgiveness.